should have been the proudest moment of my career. 5 months of 15-hour days, burnt coffee at midnight, and the steady hum of the server room that felt more like home than my own apartment. Every bug found, every dollar accounted for, every sleepless night stacked like bricks in the fortress I thought I was building for us, me and Mariah. We were supposed to be a team, her and I, both invested in making this company thrive, but in the end, I realized that team meant something different to everyone else here. When I'd started on the Orion Logistics project, I'd known it would be a game changer. Orion was the client that would push our little tech consultancy into the stratosphere. The numbers didn't lie, double the revenue in a single year. I could almost see the figures glowing in my head every time I closed my eyes. Every morning, I'd hit the office before the sun rose, my breath visible in the pre-dawn chill, my mind sharper than the coffee's bitter sting. I'd sit down at my battered laptop, notes stacked high, and build the system that would make Orion's supply chain run like a dream, like a symphony in code. I knew every line of that proposal better than my own reflection. So when Raymond, my father-in-law, CEO of Vertex Consulting, the man who sat at the head of every meeting like a benevolent dictator, walked over with that practiced grin, I didn't even flinch. "Adrien," he said, placing a hand on my laptop like a priest blessing an altar. "I'll handle the client meeting. You're not senior enough to lead something this high stakes." I stared at his hand. For a second, I thought he'd left a fingerprint on the brushed aluminum, a mark that would remind me of who really ran this place. My throat went dry. "But I built this," I managed to say, the words small and flat even to my own ears. "Every piece of it." His smile didn't falter. "You did excellent work, son. But Martin and Celeste will be joining me today. They're better suited for this level of client engagement." He used that tone, the one that made you feel like you were being patted on the head. Like I was the helpful nephew who'd carried the luggage but couldn't possibly sit at the grown-up table. I watched as he scooped up my slides, the ones I'd sweated over for weeks. Each bullet point, each diagram, each line of logic, gone from my screen and in his hands. My chest tightened. I wanted to snatch them back. I wanted to stand up and shout that they didn't know the system like I did, that they'd never understand the intricacies of the dynamic allocation protocol or the machine learning adaptation layers I designed specifically for Orion's decentralized clusters. But all that came out was a thin, bitter laugh. He nodded once, satisfied, then pivoted on his polished shoes and motioned for Martin and Celeste to follow him. Martin, who'd once asked me how to reset his corporate laptop's password. Celeste, who wore her MBA-like armor and couldn't tell a SQL injection from a bottle of ketchup. They both smiled at me as they passed, quick little barbs of courtesy that barely masked the relief that they'd been chosen and I hadn't. As the conference room door swung shut behind them, I was left with the echo of my own pulse in my ears. I sat back down at my desk, the cheap chair squeaking under me, and stared at the blank screen where my slides used to be. The cursor blinked at me like it was waiting for instructions. I could see them through the glass wall, Raymond at the head of the table, Martin gesturing like a puppet, Celeste flipping through my slides with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never written a line of code in her life. My stomach churned. I wanted to stand up, walk in there, and tell them what they were missing. That without me, the system was a shell, a polished car without an engine. I thought of the nights Mariah and I spent arguing over my hours, the dinners missed, the birthdays I'd sent apologies for, the sacrifices I'd made for this company, for her family, for us. And here I was, locked out of the most important meeting of my life. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, and closed my eyes. I could almost hear Raymond's voice, smooth as velvet, telling the Orion team about the future of logistics, about Vertex's capabilities, all while standing on the foundation I'd built. Every word he spoke was stolen from the sweat on my brow. I pictured Martin explaining the technical framework, badly. I pictured Celeste fielding questions with that brittle confidence that only held together until someone asked something real. I opened my eyes and stared through the glass. I saw Raymond pause, his hands steepled, leaning forward like the benevolent father figure he played so well. I saw Celeste nodding along and Martin trying to look engaged. And then I saw Dr. Eliza Morgan, CTO of Orion Logistics, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable but her eyes sharp, dissecting every word they said. My heart kicked up a notch. Eliza Morgan didn't suffer fools. I'd read everything about her, her patents, her research, her ruthless climb through the industry ranks. She was the one who'd insisted on a technical deep dive during the pitch, the one who'd specifically requested the lead engineer, the one I should have been talking to. But here I was, on the other side of the glass, while they paraded my work without me. I felt something tighten in my chest, a slow-burning rage that started small, like a candle flame, and then roared to life. This wasn't patience. This wasn't respect. This was erasure. I wasn't going to let that happen. Not again. Raymond was a master of optics. Even from where I sat at my desk, I could see him holding court in that conference room, the way he leaned forward just enough to look engaged but not so much to seem desperate. He had a custom suit, tailored to fit his lean frame with just the right amount of understated authority and a practiced smile that never quite reached his eyes. He used that smile the same way a magician uses a wand, to distract, to misdirect, to make people believe they were seeing something they weren't. And from behind the glass, I watched him wield it like a weapon. Martin, to his left, wore that same obsequious grin he always did when he was in the presence of power, nodding like a bobblehead every time Raymond so much as breathed. Martin had a knack for regurgitating other people's ideas in a way that made him seem insightful, but I knew better. He'd once asked me how to change a font size in PowerPoint, and now here he was, flipping through my slides like they were his own. Celeste, on Raymond's right, radiated the same cold polish I'd come to expect from her. Expensive hair, perfect nails, the kind of confidence that came from never being told no. She held my slides with the casual arrogance of someone who thought the world owed her a place at the table. She didn't even bother to look up as she scrolled through the notes I'd prepared, her lips moving as if rehearsing lines she barely understood. From my desk, I could see it all through the glass wall. Every glance, every smirk, every empty word that floated between them like smoke. My stomach twisted with a mix of anger and helplessness, like I'd built this whole thing only to watch them drive it off a cliff. And then there was me, the tech lead. The son-in-law who didn't play golf or schmooze at happy hour or pretend to laugh at Raymond's jokes. The one who coded until his eyes bled, who pulled all-nighters to make sure every calculation lined up, every model ran without error. I was the guy who knew the system better than anyone, who could have explained every variable, every risk, every reward, but I wasn't invited. Raymond had made sure of that. My wife, Mariah, had tried to console me when I told her. "That's just how my father is," she'd said, her voice soft, her eyes darting away like they always did when she was stuck between us. "You know he respects your work, Adrien. You just have to be patient." But it wasn't patience. It was erasure. And every time she said it, I felt like she was asking me to disappear, to accept that my name didn't matter as much as his approval. I tried to shake it off, to focus on the screen in front of me, but the glass kept pulling my gaze back to that room. I watched as Martin stumbled through a slide about the architecture. He was saying something about modular scalability and dynamic clustering, but his mouth moved like a broken toy, and I could see the confusion in the faces of the Orion team. And then I saw her, Dr. Eliza Morgan. She was everything I'd expected, stern, razor-sharp, the kind of leader who didn't have time for nonsense. Her eyes were fixed on Martin with the same intensity I'd once seen in a Predator documentary, focused, calculating, waiting for a weakness to reveal itself. Her arms were folded tight across her chest, a single eyebrow arched in a way that made Martin sweat. I could almost hear the ticking of the clock as the seconds stretched on. Celeste tried to jump in, flashing that PR smile of hers as she spouted a string of buzzwords that meant absolutely nothing. Strategic synergy, holistic integration, adaptive frameworks. She said it all in that sing-song voice that made me want to punch the glass. Eliza's gaze shifted to Celeste for a split second, sharp and dismissive, then cut back to Martin. I knew that look. It was the look of a surgeon realizing the scalpel was dull. I leaned forward in my chair, my pulse quickening. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. The moment the house of cards started to tremble. Martin stammered, his voice cracking as he tried to explain the dynamic allocation protocol, the one I'd spent weeks refining. I could practically hear the gears grinding in his head, the sweat beading on his forehead. Celeste shot him a look that screamed, "Get it together," but he was already too deep. Eliza's mouth tightened. Her fingers drummed on the table, a slow, steady rhythm that sounded like a countdown. My breath caught. This was it. They were about to choke. Every ounce of work I'd poured into that system, the sleepless nights, the sacrifices, was about to come crashing down because they thought they could wear my slides like a disguise. And then it happened. Eliza leaned forward, her voice calm but laced with steel. "You've mentioned the dynamic conversion protocol several times, but your documentation lacks a viable transition framework. How exactly do you plan to implement this at scale?" Martin's eyes widened. Celeste flipped pages like she was reading Braille. Raymond shifted in his chair, his practiced smile faltering for just a moment. And then, as if guided by some cosmic force, Eliza's eyes drifted past them, past the suits and the smiles, and landed on me. Through the glass, her gaze locked with mine, a silent challenge. The room went still. I felt the weight of every hour I'd put into that project, every sacrifice, every compromise, and in that moment, I knew they were about to crash, and I was the only one who could save them. My phone buzzed. I glanced down to see a message from Mariah, "Come to the conference room." Now, I stood, my legs shaky but my mind clear. This was my moment, the one they hadn't planned for, the one they couldn't control. And as I reached for the door handle, I felt something deep inside me settle, like a fire that had been waiting for the right breath of air to ignite. 3 nights ago, I made a decision that I never thought I'd have the nerve to make. It wasn't impulsive. No, it was the product of too many sleepless nights and too many backhanded compliments from people who'd never written a line of code, but somehow thought they owned every line I wrote. After Raymond's last "good job, son" speech, I sat at my desk, staring at the codebase. Every file, every function, every subroutine, my fingerprints were all over them. And that's when the thought hit me. What if I didn't let them take everything? What if, for once, I didn't let them strip my name from my own work and parade it around like a trophy? I opened the presentation slides that Martin and Celeste would use in the meeting, the same ones Raymond had insisted on taking. I scrolled to the slide on the dynamic conversion protocol, the heart of the system, the piece that made everything else more than just fancy charts and marketing jargon. And I deleted it. Not all of it, just enough to leave a gaping hole that no one but me could fill. The key component, the variable sync layer that made the system bulletproof, didn't live on the company's shared drive. It didn't even live in my email. It lived in my head, woven into the nights I'd spent working until my eyes bled. It was mine, and if they wanted it, they'd have to ask me. I didn't tell Mariah. She'd always been the peacemaker, the one who tried to bridge the gap between me and her father, between my world and theirs. She'd have called it sabotage. Maybe she'd be right. But I couldn't stand by and let them sell my work without knowing how it actually worked. I'd done that too many times, and every time I'd walked away with nothing but a polite thank you and the bitter taste of being disposable. So when I walked into the office that morning, my heart was pounding with something that felt like both guilt and triumph. I watched as Raymond, Martin, and Celeste strutted into that conference room, confident as ever. They thought they had everything they needed. They didn't. I watched from my desk as Martin flipped through the slides, his mouth moving like he was reciting lines from a script he barely understood. Celeste wore that same bright smile she'd worn at the last investor call, the one that said, "I know exactly what I'm doing," even when she didn't. And Raymond, he was the ringleader, the conductor of a performance he thought he'd choreographed perfectly. But then I saw it, Eliza Morgan's face. At first, it was polite, neutral. But as Martin kept talking, her expression changed. Her brow furrowed. Her lips pressed into a thin line. She flipped a page, then another, her eyes scanning the text like a surgeon examining an X-ray. Then she asked a question, one I couldn't hear through the glass but knew by heart. How would the system handle variable data clusters under load? How would it maintain stability across a distributed architecture with multiple data points shifting in real time? Martin's face went slack. Celeste leaned in, her smile faltering as she tried to salvage the pitch with buzzwords: agility, modular design, scalable infrastructure. I almost laughed. None of that would answer Eliza's question, because the answer wasn't in the slides. It was in me. I watched Martin blink, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. I imagined the panic in his head as he realized he was standing in front of the most critical client pitch of his life with half a solution and no way out. I felt a pang of satisfaction, like justice finally had a moment to breathe. And then, at exactly 11:14 a.m., Eliza's eyes shifted. Her gaze swept the room, skipping over Raymond and his executive pets, landing on me. It was a silent verdict. She knew. She might not know the details, but she knew there was something missing, and she knew who could supply it. A second later, my phone buzzed, vibrating so hard it nearly jumped off the desk. It was Mariah. "Come to the conference room. Now." I stared at the message, my heart pounding in my chest. This was it. The moment I'd orchestrated, the moment I'd feared, the moment I'd waited for. I stood, my legs unsteady. Every step toward that conference room felt like I was walking a tightrope over a canyon. I could feel the eyes on me, colleagues pretending not to stare, but staring all the same. I reached the door, hand on the knob, and for a split second, I hesitated. I thought about Mariah. I thought about Raymond. I thought about every time I'd let someone else take the credit, every time I'd swallowed my pride and let them use my work to climb higher. And then I thought about the nights I'd spent at that desk, alone with my code, building something no one else could even comprehend. And I opened the door. The room went silent when I stepped in, like I'd crashed a party no one had invited me to. Raymond's smile was tight, strained, his eyes darting between me and Eliza like he was trying to decide whether to acknowledge me or pretend I didn't exist. Martin looked like he'd seen a ghost. Celeste's face was pale, her eyes wide, her fingers white-knuckling a pen. Eliza didn't smile. She didn't even blink. She just folded her arms across her chest and nodded, like she'd been expecting me all along. "Mr. Greer," she said, her voice calm but commanding. "I understand you led the technical development for this project. I have some questions for you." I met her gaze, steady and unflinching. "Of course," I said. "Ask me anything." And in that moment, I felt something inside me settle. No matter what happened next, I knew one thing. I wouldn't be erased this time. I walked into the conference room like a man walking into his own trial. The air felt charged, thick with the tension of half-whispered accusations and the stale smell of corporate cologne. I saw Raymond first. His smile brittle and tight, his eyes flicking between me and the Orion team like he was deciding how best to spin my presence. Martin had his laptop open, but his screen was black. He was just staring at it like a drowning man waiting for a lifeline. Celeste tried to meet my eyes, but the moment I glanced her way, she dropped her gaze, her fingers fidgeting with her notes. It was Eliza Morgan who broke the silence. She didn't waste time on pleasantries or corporate fluff. She turned her chair slightly, her posture straight as a blade, and gestured to the empty seat across from her. "Adrien, is it?" she said. "Have a seat." Raymond cleared his throat like he wanted to reclaim the conversation, but Eliza didn't even look at him. She had the floor now, and everyone in the room knew it. I took the seat, my heart hammering but my face calm. I folded my hands on the table and waited. Raymond started to introduce me. "This is Adrien Greer, one of our analysts who assisted." I cut him off. I said, my voice steady but sharp enough to make Martin flinch. "Actually, I built the logic. All of it." Eliza's eyebrows lifted, a flicker of amusement, or maybe approval, crossing her face. "Interesting," she said, tapping a slide with the back of her pen. "Your documentation lacks a viable transition framework. Without it, this proposal can't be implemented at scale. What's missing?" I didn't hesitate. I leaned forward, elbows on the table, and met her gaze head-on. "A hybridized variable sync layer paired with a multi-threading migration protocol, designed specifically for Orion's data clusters," I said. The words tumbled out in a steady rhythm, my confidence growing with each syllable. I didn't need notes. I didn't need slides. I'd lived this system, breathed it, and every piece of it was embedded in my memory like code written in my bones. Eliza's eyes lit up. She reached for a marker and gestured to the whiteboard behind me. "Show me," she said. I stood, the chair scraping softly against the floor, and took the marker from her hand. I turned to the board and began to draw. Clusters, nodes, variable layers, the dynamic conversion protocol that made everything connect like a living, breathing organism. I explained how the sync layer adapted in real time to shifting data structures, how the migration protocol ensured zero downtime during transitions, how every module talked to every other module like a conversation rather than a monologue. I felt the room shift. Martin's face was pale, his eyes darting between me and the board like he was trying to keep up. Celeste scribbled notes that made no sense. I could tell by the way her pen moved, frantic and aimless. Raymond's expression was a mask, but his jaw was tight, his hands clenched in his lap. And then I looked at Eliza. She was watching me with the kind of focus that made the air crackle, her pen still, her eyes locked on mine. I felt like I was finally being seen, not as a junior analyst, not as Raymond's son-in-law, but as the expert I'd always been. When I finished, I capped the marker and turned back to the table. The room was silent for a moment, the kind of silence that comes when the truth finally lands and no one can pretend otherwise. Eliza stood and extended her hand. "Mr. Greer," she said, her voice steady and clear, "if we go forward with this, you lead implementation, or we don't go forward at all." Raymond opened his mouth to protest, but Eliza held up a hand. "No offense, Mr. Godwin, but I've seen enough corporate smoke and mirrors. I want the person who actually built this system. Otherwise, Orion walks." Her words fell like a hammer on the table. I felt a rush of adrenaline, a kind of vindication I hadn't known I'd been craving. For a second, I glanced at Mariah, who sat in the back corner, her lips parted in shock. She looked between her father and me, her eyes wide. Raymond's face was an intricate mask of fury and forced composure. "Of course," he said, his voice tight. "Adrien will lead the rollout." I felt his words like a challenge, like a line drawn in the sand. I turned to Eliza and shook her hand. Her grip was firm, her eyes unblinking. "I look forward to it," I said. She gave a curt nod, then turned to gather her team. The Orion execs began to pack up their things, the room suddenly a blur of movement. Martin and Celeste sat frozen, their faces drained of color. I took my seat again, my hands steady now. Raymond leaned in close, his voice a low growl. "You'd better be ready to deliver," he said, his teeth clenched. I met his glare without flinching. "I always was," I said. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't just a pawn in his game, I was a player, and the board was finally shifting in my favor. 3 hours later, I found myself in the HR conference room. It was smaller than the main boardroom, but the tension inside felt like it could crack the walls. Raymond sat at the head of the table, his expression carved from granite, lips pressed into a thin, controlled line. Martin and Celeste flanked him like guards, their eyes fixed on me with a mixture of accusation and something close to fear. Mariah sat at the far end, hands folded in her lap, eyes darting between us like she'd been caught in the middle of a war she couldn't escape. HR's lead, a woman named Karen with too perfect hair and a voice like a paper cut, cleared her throat and launched into the charges. "Mr. Greer, you're being reviewed for possible misconduct, including withholding vital information, undermining leadership, and making the company look foolish in front of a critical client." She didn't even blink as she read it out, as though it were an everyday occurrence to be accused of sabotaging your own project. I leaned back in my chair, forcing myself to breathe evenly. I'd known this was coming the second Eliza shook my hand. I'd made my move, and now Raymond was making his. He thought he could bury me under protocol and politics, but he'd underestimated just how prepared I was. "I'd like to respond to those allegations," I said, my voice calm, even. Karen gave a tight nod, and I opened the folder I'd brought with me, a thick stack of emails, drafts, notes, and timestamps that I'd carefully curated over months of late nights and long weekends. I laid them out like cards in a high-stakes game. Every email, every draft, every internal memo I've ever sent about the Orion project is here, I said, sliding them across the table toward Karen. "You'll see that every key component of the system was developed by me. Every critical piece of logic came from my hands. And if you'll notice, every single presentation slide that was used in the pitch was prepared and authored by me." I watched as she flipped through the pages, her brow furrowing, lips pressing together. Martin shifted in his chair, his knee bouncing like a nervous tick. Celeste stared at the table, avoiding my gaze. Raymond didn't move, his hands folded like a priest waiting to deliver a sermon. I turned to face him, holding his gaze. "You took my work and tried to present it without me. You undermined me," I said, my voice steady. "If I hadn't stepped in, you would have tanked the deal in front of our biggest client." "I didn't undermine the company, I saved it." His nostrils flared. "You acted against the company's best interests," he snapped. "You withheld a key component. Because you cut me out." I shot back, the words sharper than I'd intended. "You thought you could take the credit without understanding what you were selling. You thought you could wear my work like a suit and walk into that room without me." Even Mariah flinched at the heat in my tone. For a heartbeat, the room went silent. Karen looked between us, eyes wide. Martin and Celeste shifted in their seats, the weight of the moment pressing down on all of us. Raymond opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, Karen's phone buzzed on the table. She frowned, picked it up, and read the screen. Her eyes widened. "Mr. Godwin," she said, her voice tight. "We've just received an email from Dr. Eliza Morgan." Raymond's jaw tensed. "What does it say?" Karen read it aloud, each word a nail in the coffin of their accusations. "Eliza Morgan, I am writing to formally state that Vertex's success in securing our contract is due to the work and direct involvement of Adrien Greer. I insist that Adrien Greer be assigned as the lead for the Orion project, reporting directly on all implementation matters. Failure to comply with this requirement will result in the immediate withdrawal of our contract." The room fell silent. Even the hum of the AC seemed to fade into nothing. I watched the color drain from Martin's face. Celeste's eyes flicked to me and then away, like she couldn't bear to look at the truth staring her in the face. Mariah's lips parted, her eyes wide with a mix of shock and something like relief. Raymond's hands clenched into fists. He started, his voice hoarse. No, I said, my own voice low and steady, the kind of voice that comes from too many sleepless nights and too many years of being underestimated. She demanded it, Raymond. Not me. She saw the truth, that you were willing to sell a product you didn't understand, a system you couldn't build. And she's not the type to be fooled by suits and handshakes. Karen cleared her throat. Given the client's explicit requirement, and the documentation provided by Mr. Greer, we have no choice but to comply. Raymond's eyes burned into mine, but I didn't look away. I'd waited too long for this moment. Too many times I'd been told to wait my turn, to let others take the credit, to be a team player. But this time, the truth had its own seat at the table, and it was on my side. Adrien, Mariah said, her voice small. Did you have to do it like this? I turned to her, the ache of too many compromises tightening in my chest. It's the only way they'd listen, I said. It's the only way they'd see me. Raymond stood abruptly, his chair scraping the floor. This isn't over, he hissed. I smiled a small, hard smile. I know, I said, but now it's my move. And as I gathered my papers and stood to leave, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders, like I'd finally stepped out from under someone else's shadow and into the light that had always been waiting for me. Raymond called me into his office later that afternoon. His assistant gave me a strained smile, like she'd just watched a train wreck but didn't have the nerve to say a word. I stepped into the familiar space, mahogany desk, floor-to-ceiling windows with a view of the city skyline, a shelf lined with awards and plaques he'd never let me forget. It felt less like a workplace and more like a shrine to his ego. He sat behind the desk, arms folded, his face carved into an expression of forced calm. Close the door, he said, his voice low. I did, feeling the weight of it click shut behind me like a cell. I took a seat across from him, feeling every bit the interloper in a space designed to remind people who was in charge. He let the silence stretch just a little too long, the way he always did when he wanted control. I'd seen him use it on competitors, on clients, on his own board of directors. But this time, it didn't work. I held his gaze, letting him know I wasn't intimidated anymore. He sighed, a practiced move that made it look like the world's burdens were his to carry alone. You put me in a difficult position today, he said, his voice carefully measured. I didn't react. I'd learned by now that his difficult positions usually involved him getting exactly what he wanted while everyone else took the blame. No, I said, my voice even. You put yourself there. He blinked, a flicker of something crossing his face, surprise, maybe, or just annoyance that I wasn't playing the game. I just let the truth speak, I added. His jaw tightened. You understand this company doesn't reward insubordination, he said, his tone hardening. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees. And I understand that it should reward results, I shot back. I watched his face carefully, the way his eyes narrowed, the muscle in his jaw twitching. He was used to people backing down, to nods and yes sirs and people who knew their place. But I wasn't that man anymore. Not after what happened in that conference room. Not after Eliza Morgan's email. You're my son-in-law, he said, like the words tasted bitter. Don't forget that. I nearly laughed. And that's the problem, isn't it? I said, my voice steady, cold. You wanted me to stay in the background, to be the support act to your headliner. But I didn't want favors. I wanted fairness. He stared at me, eyes like chips of stone. Fairness, he echoed, as if it were a foreign concept. Do you have any idea what you've done to this company's reputation today? The board is furious. HR is a mess. And Mariah's not the one who took my work and tried to pass it off as her father's, I said, cutting him off. Mariah's not the one who thought they could sell a product they didn't understand. That was you. His lips thinned into a hard line, his knuckles whitening on the edge of the desk. You've always been difficult, he said, his voice trembling with barely restrained anger. Too independent. Too defiant. I shrugged. Maybe that's what it takes to actually get something done around here. Silence stretched between us like a chasm. I could see the storm raging behind his eyes. The urge to crush me, to put me back in my place, was written in every line of his face. But I also saw something else, something he couldn't hide even if he tried. Fear. Because he knew that without me, the Orion deal would collapse. that every promise he'd made to the board, to investors, to his own fragile ego, was built on my work. And now the client had demanded me, not him. "Here's what's going to happen," he said at last, his voice low and brittle. "You're going to lead the Orion rollout. Report directly to me. I'll oversee the project, and if this succeeds, you'll reevaluate my title," I finished, my voice flat. "Yes, I know how this goes." His eyes narrowed. "And if it doesn't," he continued, "you're gone. Don't think for a second that you're irreplaceable." I sat back in my chair, feeling the weight of the moment. I'd come here to fight for what was mine, and now he was trying to leash me with the same old threats. But I learned something in that conference room. Fear only works when you let it. "I've been irreplaceable since the day I started this project," I said, my tone calm, matter of fact. "You just didn't want to admit it." He leaned forward, his face inches from mine. "Don't test me, Adrien. I'm still the CEO of this company. Don't forget who gave you this opportunity in the first place." I met his stare without flinching. "And don't forget who saved your ass in front of Orion," I replied. "Eliza Morgan didn't just choose me to lead this rollout, she demanded it. And if you think you can replace me, then you clearly don't understand the system you're trying to sell." His face went red, a vein pulsing at his temple. But he didn't argue, because he knew I was right. I stood, gathering my folder. "I'll deliver," I said, my voice steady. "Because I believe in the work. But I won't do it to save your pride. I'm doing it because it's mine. And because I won't let my name get buried under your politics." I turned to leave, pausing at the door. "One more thing," I added, glancing back at him. "Respect isn't given, it's earned. And it's protected." I didn't wait for his response. I walked out of that office with my head high, the skyline blazing beyond the glass like a promise. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long time, I knew that I was done letting other people define my worth. From now on, I was the architect of my own legacy. Days later, I was standing in the lab, running performance tests on the Orion module, when my phone rang with a sharp buzz. The screen showed Eliza's name, and for a moment, I let it vibrate in my hand, feeling the weight of that call. When I finally answered, her voice was calm, but carried that same sharpness I'd come to respect. "Adrien," she said, not wasting time. "We're ready to proceed. But with conditions." I leaned against the work table, the hum of the servers behind me like the pulse of my own thoughts. "Conditions?" I asked, though I had a feeling I already knew. Eliza didn't pause. "We want you leading the rollout. Formally. No more of this, one of our analysts' nonsense. I want your name at the top of every report. Every milestone." I felt something tighten in my chest. Part disbelief, part vindication. "That's what I want too," I said, my voice steady. "Good," she replied. "I also want quarterly reviews, with me, not with your executive team. I'm not interested in Martin's buzzwords or Celeste's spin. I want to talk to the person who actually knows the system." I couldn't help but smile, imagining Martin's face when he realized he wouldn't get to play the big shot anymore. "I can do that," I said. She continued, her tone even more precise. "And I want it in writing that if Vertex fails to support you, resources, approvals, the things you need to succeed, Orion reserves the right to hire you directly as a consultant. We'll match your current compensation plus a performance bonus." My breath caught for a second. A parachute. One Raymond couldn't control. One that meant even if he tried to box me out, I'd have a landing place. "That's generous," I said, carefully. Eliza snorted lightly. "It's practical. Talent like yours shouldn't be trapped behind corporate glass. I've seen too many good engineers ground down by politics." I didn't respond for a moment, letting her words sink in. She was offering me something that no one else ever had, an acknowledgement that I mattered beyond the confines of a single company's hierarchy. A safety net, yes, but also respect. "I want that too," I finally said. "I want to be recognized for what I've built, not who I married." Silence hummed on the line for a second. Then she said, "I'll send over the agreement. You'll need to have your legal team review it." I laughed softly, imagining Raymond's face when he saw that clause. "Oh, I'll make sure they do." She paused. "Don't let them push you around, Adrien. You're the reason we're here. Remember that." The line went dead, but her words echoed in my mind like a bell ringing long after the sound had faded. I set my phone down, staring at the server rack, feeling like I'd just been handed a lifeline. And then I knew exactly what I had to do. I scheduled a meeting with Raymond, Martin, Celeste, and HR. I wanted it on the record, in front of every pair of eyes that mattered. When I walked into the conference room, Raymond looked up from his phone, his face carefully neutral. Martin looked nervous, shifting papers like a kid who hadn't studied for the test. Celeste's lips were pressed into that tight line she used when she knew she was about to lose control. "I just got off the phone with Eliza Morgan," I said, taking a seat at the head of the table, the spot usually reserved for Raymond. "She's ready to proceed with the Orion rollout, but she has some conditions." I let that hang for a second, the weight of it settling in the room. Raymond's jaw tightened. "What conditions?" he asked, his voice low and controlled. I met his gaze without flinching. "First, I'll be leading the rollout formally. All reports, milestones, and deliverables will come directly through me. No intermediaries. No filters. She wants the person who actually built the system." Martin opened his mouth, but I held up a hand. "Second, she wants quarterly reviews directly with her. She's not interested in marketing spin or executive summaries. She wants the technical truth from the technical lead." Celeste's face reddened, her fingers drumming on the table. Raymond's lips parted like he was about to object, but I continued. "And third," I said, my voice clear and calm, "there will be a written clause in the contract stating that if Vertex fails to support me, resources, approvals, whatever, I can be hired directly by Orion as a consultant. At my current compensation plus performance bonuses." The silence that followed felt like a thunderclap in the small room. Martin swallowed hard. Celeste looked like she might scream. Raymond's face darkened, a vein pulsing at his temple. "That's betrayal," he spat, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage. "That's insubordination of the highest order." I leaned back in my chair, folding my arms. "No," I said. "That's insurance. For me. For Orion. And for the system I built. I'm not going to let this project fail because of office politics." He slammed his palm on the table, making Martin jump. "You're putting a noose around this company's neck," he growled. I met his eyes, my own voice cold. "No, Raymond. You did that when you tried to take credit for my work without understanding it. I'm just making sure that if you sabotage this, I won't be the one who falls." HR cleared her throat, her eyes darting between us. "It's a reasonable clause, given the client's insistence," she said carefully. "We can work with legal to draft it." Raymond stared at her like she'd just kicked his dog. "You're all spineless," he muttered, his voice low. I stood, gathering my notes. "Spineless or not, this is happening," I said. "Because Eliza Morgan sees the truth, even if you don't. She knows the value of the person who actually built the system." I paused, looking at each of them in turn. "I'm not asking for permission anymore. I'm stating the terms. If you can't handle that, Orion's more than willing to take me on their own." And with that, I left the room, my pulse steady, my head high. I didn't look back. I'd fought too hard to stand in anyone's shadow now. The all-hands meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. sharp, and by 8:45, the entire company had gathered in the main conference room. People whispered to each other, eyes darting around like they were waiting for a storm that hadn't yet arrived. I stood off to the side, arms folded, watching the tension build. I'd gotten used to that feeling, a room full of eyes that didn't quite know where to look when I walked in. But today was different. Today, I had the leverage, and everyone knew it. At precisely 9 a.m., Raymond walked in. He was dressed in his best navy suit, the one that screamed authority, power, and control. But I could see the tightness in his jaw, the strain behind his smile as he looked over the room. He cleared his throat and adjusted his cufflinks like he always did before a big announcement. Martin stood just behind him, his face pale, eyes flickering nervously between the crowd and the floor. Celeste wasn't there. She'd called in sick, which was probably the most honest thing she'd done all year. The hush in the room deepened as Raymond stepped forward, his hands clasped in front of him. "Good morning, everyone," he began, his voice even but lacking its usual self-assured lilt. "I know you've all heard about the Orion contract, and I'm pleased to confirm that we've secured it, $9.5 million over 2 years." The crowd let out a collective exhale, polite applause breaking out as people glanced at one another. Raymond nodded, pretending to bask in the approval, but I could see the tension in his neck, the way his eyes darted toward me every other second. "This contract is a huge win for Vertex," he continued, his tone a touch too bright. "It's a testament to the hard work of our team, especially our technical division." He paused, his gaze landing on me like a blade. I felt the air in the room shift, every eye turning to see what came next. He cleared his throat again, the words sticking in his mouth. "And leading the implementation," he said, like it cost him oxygen, is Adrien Greer, our newly promoted Director of Technical Solutions. For a second, the room went still. Then polite applause rippled through the crowd, half-hearted and cautious. Some people clapped a little too enthusiastically, like they were overcompensating for the tension in the room. Others clapped slowly, their eyes darting between Raymond and me like they weren't sure who they were supposed to be loyal to. I stood there, letting it wash over me, my face calm but my mind roaring. After months of being sidelined, after being forced to watch my own work paraded around without my name on it, I was finally being acknowledged. Raymond's eyes flickered with something, resentment, maybe, or the realization that he couldn't control the narrative anymore. He stepped back slightly, as if the weight of the admission had knocked the wind out of him. Martin shifted uncomfortably, his hands clasped in front of him, his knuckles white. I caught his eye, and he looked away, his cheeks reddening. I didn't expect a thank you. I didn't need one. This wasn't about gratitude. It was about respect, and that had never come easy in this place. From the back of the room, I saw Mariah. She stood by the door, arms crossed, her face unreadable. Her eyes met mine for a moment, and I couldn't tell what she was thinking. She'd always been a mystery that way, half loyalty, half fear of rocking the boat. After the applause faded, people began to murmur, conversation sprouting like weeds after a rain. I heard my name whispered, saw heads turn. I'd become the headline, the story that couldn't be ignored. Raymond cleared his throat once more, forcing his smile back into place. "Thank you all," he said, his voice strained. "Let's make this project a success." He stepped away from the microphone, and the crowd began to disperse, people glancing at me with a mix of curiosity and something like caution, as if they weren't sure who I was anymore. I stayed where I was, letting them file out. I didn't rush to greet anyone. I didn't need to. I'd spent too many years chasing approval that was never going to come. Now, I was standing in the light, and it felt right. Raymond approached me, his face a careful mask of fatherly concern. "We'll talk in my office later," he said, his tone clipped. I nodded once, not giving him the satisfaction of a deeper reaction. "Of course," I said. He turned and left, Martin trailing after him like a lost puppy. I felt a presence beside me and turned to see Mariah, her eyes searching mine. "Did you have to do it like that?" she asked, her voice low, almost a whisper. I studied her for a long moment, the question hanging between us like a challenge. "Did you have to stand by and watch him do it the other way?" I finally replied, my tone even but carrying a weight I knew she felt. She looked away, her lips pressing together, and I felt a pang of sadness for what we'd become. Two people standing on opposite sides of the same story. I wanted to reach for her, to tell her I was still the same man who'd brought her coffee at midnight while she studied, the same man who'd cheered for her every victory. But I couldn't. Not now. Not with everything between us. Some truths didn't need explaining, and some questions didn't need answers. I watched her walk away, her steps slow, her head down. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't the one who had to look away. I turned and headed for my office, the title of Director of Technical Solutions ringing in my head like a bell. It wasn't just a title. It was a stake in the ground, a marker that said I wouldn't be erased again. I wouldn't be silenced. And as I sat down at my desk, I felt a quiet satisfaction settle over me. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, I was fighting from a place of strength. And that made all the difference. I didn't waste any time after that announcement. Raymond might have tried to salvage his pride by framing it like a victory lap for the company, but I knew the truth. This project had always been mine, and now, finally, I had the authority to run it the way it deserved. I built my own team, handpicking people who knew the value of real work over politics. Made from systems, sharp, analytical, the kind of engineer who could diagnose a problem from 3 lines of code and have a fix by the time you finished asking the question. Owen from security, an ex-military guy who'd once rebuilt our entire cybersecurity framework after an audit nearly tanked our last project. Ravi from development, a quiet genius whose hands never stopped moving, his mind always 3 steps ahead of the rest of us. And Dammy, a brilliant junior who reminded me of me. Hungry, underestimated, brimming with potential that no one had taken the time to see. I brought them together in a windowless conference room, the kind of place Raymond would have dismissed as too low-class for a high-profile project, and I laid it out straight. "We're building something that matters," I told them, standing at the whiteboard with a marker in hand. "Orion is relying on us. I don't care about titles. I don't care about politics. I care about results." And if you're here, it's because I trust you to deliver. May looked at me with that sharp gaze of hers and asked the question I'd been expecting. What happens if Raymond and the others try to meddle? Her voice was steady, but her eyes held the weight of every engineer who'd ever been sold out by their own company. I met her gaze. They'll try, I said. Count on it. But they can't sell what they don't understand. We built the engine. We own the system. They might try to take credit, but they'll fail because they don't have the knowledge to sustain it. Owen leaned back in his chair, arms folded. So we're a rogue unit now? I gave him a tight smile. We're the unit that actually delivers, I said. Call it what you want. That made Ravi chuckle, and even Dammy cracked a grin. The tension in the room eased just enough for me to see the spark catch fire. These were people who'd been underestimated, overlooked, the quiet ones who carried the weight of the company while others basked in the spotlight. I knew what that felt like, and I'd be damned if I let them go through it alone. We got to work. Days blurred into nights, lines of code into architecture diagrams, flowcharts into whiteboard sketches that filled every inch of available space. We worked shoulder to shoulder, fueled by caffeine, purpose, and the quiet rage of people who knew they'd been left behind. Every day I saw the same hunger in their eyes that I felt in my own chest. We weren't just building software. We were building proof that the ones they called support were actually the backbone of this entire operation. When the Orion team arrived for the first milestone review, I made sure we were ready. Eliza walked in with her team, as sharp as ever, scanning the room like a general assessing her troops. She didn't waste time on small talk. Show me what you've got, she said. And we did. May walked her through the dynamic allocation module, how it adapted in real time, shifting resources seamlessly between data clusters without a hiccup. Owen demonstrated the security protocols that would make even the most hardened hackers sweat: encrypted handshakes, dynamic IP cycling, adaptive firewalls. Ravi showed the data integrity checks that flagged even the tiniest anomaly before it could become a problem. And Dammy, who had worked night after night on the UI layer, presented a demo so smooth it made the system look like it had always belonged to Orion. Eliza watched it all, nodding occasionally, asking the kind of questions that proved she knew exactly what she was looking at. And when it was over, she turned to me with that rare smile that felt like a reward in itself. This is what partnership looks like, she said, her voice carrying enough weight to make even the skeptics at Vertex sit up and pay attention. I felt a swell of pride, not just for me, but for my team, for every late night, every missed dinner, every sacrifice they'd made to get us here. We weren't just a footnote anymore. We were the headline. But victory, I learned, comes with its own complications. Raymond avoided me now, only addressing me through clipped emails that felt like they'd been vetted by a lawyer. Celeste tried to salvage her relevance, inserting herself into investor calls and pretending she'd been at the heart of the Orion project from the beginning. I let it slide the first time, chalking it up to the same old politics. But then she did it again. This time on a major call with stakeholders, painting herself as the technical lead who'd overseen the project's development. That was the last straw. The next day, I joined the weekly investor call. When her voice hit the speaker, polished and confident, spinning a tale about her role in the project, I let her finish, and then I unmuted my line. Actually, I said, my tone steady but carrying a quiet authority that left no room for argument. I led every aspect of the Orion development. Celeste was not involved in the technical build. Any implication otherwise is inaccurate and should be corrected. The silence on the call was deafening. Investors shifted uncomfortably, and I could practically feel the heat coming off Celeste's side of the line. I didn't wait for her response. I gave them the milestones, the achievements, the metrics that mattered, and I signed off with a simple, "Thank you for your continued support." After that, she didn't try to take credit again. I no longer whispered. I no longer waited. I documented. I demanded. And I delivered. Every time someone tried to twist the narrative, I had the receipts. Every time someone tried to shade the truth, I brought the spotlight. We delivered Phase 1 of Orion in record time. Eliza sent a handwritten note, an actual handwritten note, thanking the team and praising the partnership. I framed it and hung it in our workroom. It wasn't just a thank you. It was proof. Proof that we were seen. Proof that we were more than just the people behind the glass. For too long, I'd let other people define my story. For too long, I'd let them decide where I belonged. But not anymore. I wasn't just building a system. I was building a legacy, one that couldn't be erased by a fancy title or a stolen slide deck. And as I looked around at my team, May scribbling on the whiteboard, Owen testing the firewall, Ravi debugging code at a speed that made my head spin, Dammy leaning over his laptop with a grin. I knew we were more than just a team. We were the underrated, the underestimated, the ones they never saw coming. And that, I realized, was our greatest strength. I didn't waste any time after that announcement. Raymond might have tried to salvage his pride by framing it like a victory lap for the company, but I knew the truth. This project had always been mine, and now, finally, I had the authority to run it the way it deserved. I built my own team, handpicking people who knew the value of real work over politics. May from systems, sharp, analytical, the kind of engineer who could diagnose a problem from 3 lines of code and have a fix by the time you finished asking the question. Owen from security, an ex-military guy who'd once rebuilt our entire cybersecurity framework after an audit nearly tanked our last project. Ravi from development, a quiet genius whose hands never stopped moving, his mind always 3 steps ahead of the rest of us. And Dammy, a brilliant junior who reminded me of me. Hungry, underestimated, brimming with potential that no one had taken the time to see. I brought them together in a windowless conference room, the kind of place Raymond would have dismissed as too low-class for a high-profile project, and I laid it out straight. We're building something that matters, I told them, standing at the whiteboard with a marker in hand. Orion is relying on us. I don't care about titles. I don't care about politics. I care about results. And if you're here, it's because I trust you to deliver. May looked at me with that sharp gaze of hers and asked the question I'd been expecting. What happens if Raymond and the others try to meddle? Her voice was steady, but her eyes held the weight of every engineer who'd ever been sold out by their own company. I met her gaze. They'll try, I said. Count on it. But they can't sell what they don't understand. We built the engine. We own the system. They might try to take credit, but they'll fail because they don't have the knowledge to sustain it. Owen leaned back in his chair, arms folded. So we're a rogue unit now? I gave him a tight smile. We're the unit that actually delivers, I said. Call it what you want. That made Ravi chuckle, and even Dammy cracked a grin. The tension in the room eased just enough for me to see the spark catch fire. These were people who'd been underestimated, overlooked, the quiet ones who carried the weight of the company while others basked in the spotlight. I knew what that felt like, and I'd be damned if I let them go through it alone. We got to work. Days blurred into nights, lines of code into architecture diagrams, flowcharts into whiteboard sketches that filled every inch of available space. We worked shoulder to shoulder, fueled by caffeine, purpose, and the quiet rage of people who knew they'd been left behind. Every day I saw the same hunger in their eyes that I felt in my own chest. We weren't just building software. We were building proof that the ones they called support were actually the backbone of this entire operation. When the Orion team arrived for the first milestone review, I made sure we were ready. Eliza walked in with her team, as sharp as ever, scanning the room like a general assessing her troops. She didn't waste time on small talk. Show me what you've got, she said. And we did. May walked her through the dynamic allocation module, how it adapted in real time, shifting resources seamlessly between data clusters without a hiccup. Owen demonstrated the security protocols that would make even the most hardened hackers sweat: encrypted handshakes, dynamic IP cycling, adaptive firewalls. Ravi showed the data integrity checks that flagged even the tiniest anomaly before it could become a problem. And Dammy, who had worked night after night on the UI layer, presented a demo so smooth it made the system look like it had always belonged to Orion. Eliza watched it all, nodding occasionally, asking the kind of questions that proved she knew exactly what she was looking at. And when it was over, she turned to me with that rare smile that felt like a reward in itself. This is what partnership looks like, she said, her voice carrying enough weight to make even the skeptics at Vertex sit up and pay attention. I felt a swell of pride, not just for me but for my team, for every late night, every missed dinner, every sacrifice they'd made to get us here. We weren't just a footnote anymore. We were the headline. But victory, I learned, comes with its own complications. Raymond avoided me now, only addressing me through clipped emails that felt like they'd been vetted by a lawyer. Celeste tried to salvage her relevance, inserting herself into investor calls and pretending she'd been at the heart of the Orion project from the beginning. I let it slide the first time, chalking it up to the same old politics. But then she did it again. this time on a major call with stakeholders, painting herself as the technical lead who'd overseen the project's development. That was the last straw. The next day, I joined the weekly investor call. When her voice hit the speaker, polished and confident, spinning a tale about her role in the project, I let her finish, and then I unmuted my line. Actually, I said, my tone steady but carrying a quiet authority that left no room for argument. I led every aspect of the Orion development. Celeste was not involved in the technical build. Any implication otherwise is inaccurate and should be corrected. The silence on the call was deafening. Investors shifted uncomfortably, and I could practically feel the heat coming off Celeste's side of the line. I didn't wait for her response. I gave them the milestones, the achievements, the metrics that mattered, and I signed off with a simple, "Thank you for your continued support." After that, she didn't try to take credit again. I no longer whispered. I no longer waited. I documented. I demanded. And I delivered. Every time someone tried to twist the narrative, I had the receipts. Every time someone tried to shade the truth, I brought the spotlight. We delivered Phase 1 of Orion in record time. Eliza sent a handwritten note, an actual handwritten note, thanking the team and praising the partnership. I framed it and hung it in our workroom. It wasn't just a thank you. It was proof. Proof that we were seen. Proof that we were more than just the people behind the glass. For too long, I'd let other people define my story. For too long, I'd let them decide where I belonged. But not anymore. I wasn't just building a system. I was building a legacy, one that couldn't be erased by a fancy title or a stolen slide deck. And as I looked around at my team, May scribbling on the whiteboard, Owen testing the firewall, Ravi debugging code at a speed that made my head spin, Dammy leaning over his laptop with a grin, I knew we were more than just a team. We were the underrated, the underestimated, the ones they never saw coming. And that, I realized, was our greatest strength. 6 months later, everything had changed. The name Adrien Greer carried weight, not just in the halls of Vertex, but across the entire Orion partnership. The rollout had been a resounding success, 2 phases delivered, both ahead of schedule, both under budget. Even Eliza Morgan, who'd started with that no-nonsense edge, now spoke of me and my team with a respect that resonated throughout the industry. We were no longer a footnote. We were the standard. 2 new clients had come in during that time, both demanding that Adrien's team lead their implementations. The words felt like a brand, a badge of honor I wore without apology. I saw the subtle shifts in the office. People who used to dismiss me now paused to ask for advice. Martin gave me a wide berth, avoiding eye contact in the hallway. Celeste no longer dared to put her name on anything that might come across my desk. Even Raymond, who once tried to keep me in the shadows, was forced to acknowledge my role. He called me into his office one afternoon, the city skyline a glowing canvas behind him. He sat with his arms crossed, his expression a mask of forced civility. "You've made your point," he said, his voice quiet but laced with tension. I watched him closely, weighing every word before I spoke. "Good," I replied, leaning back in the chair. "Because I'm not playing backup anymore." He shifted uncomfortably, like the words stung in places he'd never admit. "You've built a reputation here," he said. "People trust you. Clients trust you." I didn't smile. I didn't let him off the hook. "They trust me because I deliver," I said. "Because I've earned it every single step of the way. Not because of my last name, or my title, or who I married." His jaw clenched. He extended his hand across the desk, a gesture that felt like a reluctant truce. "Congratulations," he said, his voice brittle. "You've proven yourself." I looked at his hand for a long moment, then let it hang in the air. I stood, my own hands at my sides. "Respect isn't handed out," I said, my voice low and steady. "It's earned and protected." And I left him sitting there, his hands still outstretched, the words hanging between us like a challenge. As I stepped out into the hallway, I felt lighter than I had in years. Every step felt like a claim staked in the ground I'd fought so hard to own. Just outside his office, Mariah waited, her expression complicated. She searched my face like she was looking for the man she'd once known. "You're different now," she said, her voice soft. I paused, my eyes steady on hers. "No," I said. "I just stopped letting people speak over me." She opened her mouth like she wanted to say more, but I didn't give her the chance. I turned away, walking down the hallway that now felt like mine in a way it never had before. Every door, every window reflected the man I'd become. A man who'd built something real, something that couldn't be taken away with a single handshake or a stolen credit slide. As I left the office, The sun hit my face, warm and sure, and I realized that for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of what came next. Because I knew, no matter what, they'd have to deal with me on my terms. And that was the real victory.